This is Duke University.
Good morning, everyone. How are you all doing today? Well, first of all, thank you so much to the program for inviting me. It's wonderful to be back home and to be introduced by one's dissertation advisor is really an honor and a treat. And the thing I'll say about Bill Chafe is, and since I already have my PhD from Duke, you can't accuse me of trying to kind of talk up. But Bill always treated me as a colleague, and he treated everyone in the Behind the Veil Project as a colleague, and really set an example for how you build comparative ethnic studies, how you build African American studies, how you build Latinx studies as well. So like everyone else this morning, and by the way, thank you so much for that amazing opening. I mean, the opening remarks have really challenged me as well to kind of throw away my presentation or what I was going to say earlier, to really talk about, in part, the crisis that we are living in now. It's a crisis of many different dimensions. It's an institutional crisis in terms of ethnic studies writ large. I hear the same thing, you know, many of the same narratives of overburdened faculty. Where I teach, University of Florida, which is a very large public university, I'm the faculty advisor for so many different so-called Hispanic student organizations, I can't even keep count. So for example, I'm the faculty advisor for the Venezuelan Student Association. And a lot of my colleagues say, Paul, I didn't know you're Venezuelan. And I said, well, we all are Venezuelan, right, you know? But we're, as your dean mentioned, we have to perform double duty the first day we really walk into the door of our academic institutions, wherever they are. Now, I plan this morning to talk about my new book, An African American and Latinx History of the United States, and I will talk about that. It's been an exciting, just last month, the book was published on January 31st, just to give you a sense for how much Latinx studies and African American studies are in demand. Since January 31st, I counted this during the opening remarks, I've already done 25 book events. Now these are multiple events. I've not been to 25 different cities, but these are multiple events at single cities. So for example, at UC Santa Barbara, I gave a campus-wide lecture. I also talked to a group of high school students and their teachers. I went out and talked at a community center, which had been called El Centro, which is kind of the heart of the Chicano community in Santa Barbara, which had been devastated by the terrible rains and weather last year. In DC, my first book event was with Charlie Cobb, a great veteran of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, with a group of teachers from the South Bronx who came down to DC to be with us. Now, that event was during the AHA conference, the American Historical Association. The book hadn't even been published yet, and yet all these teachers had read the book. And I said, where did you get it from? You know, and somehow they had gotten it. But the reason I mention this is to tell you that the hunger for the kind of work that we do here in places like Latino studies, African American studies, teachers, administrators, principals in the high school level, community colleges, I've done several community college events, comparative ethnic studies in the California community colleges is thriving. I did an event at San Jose City College, and it was really cool because two of my former students now are instructors at City College. City College is one of the real iconic gateways for first-generation college students like myself. And I walk into the room, it's filled with people, there's about 150 people, and they had 3 big boxes of my new book. And I noticed they didn't have a cashier or a credit card swipe or anything. And I said, oh, you know, we have to wait for the bookstore people. And I said, oh, no, we're giving your book away. We're using our Hispanic Serving Institution funds. And they actually raffled the book. And they were using it as community outreach to bring people onto City College campus. When I was here in the 90s, and I know Bill can remember this, it was an amazing time to be in North Carolina and to do African American studies and what we called back then Latino studies. Now, when I taught at UC Santa Cruz, some of my colleagues said, you can't use Latino studies. That's colonial. And so we had great discussions, like when you were saying, what do I call myself today? Am I Chicano? Am I Latino? Am I Latinx? But Duke in the 90s was really incredible because coming here in 93, I was part of that kind of explosion of population of Latinos. Now, most of them were not going to grad school at Duke or Chapel Hill. Most of them are working in meatpacking, in agriculture, and service, and restaurants, and those things. The first week I was here, I was recruited to be a board member of the North Carolina Farm Worker Project, and the first thing we had to deal with was a group of workers, migrant workers, in just living in a labor camp just east of Benson, who were being kept in slavery. I mean, I'm not talking about metaphorical slavery, I'm talking about real slavery. These are migrant workers from Central America. Another organizing campaign that we worked on was the Mount Olive pickle boycott. And as a grad student, it was really amazing to kind of reconnect with my labor organizing roots. I worked with the United Farm Workers for a number of years on the Chateau Saint Michel boycott campaign. That's really where I learned what we call now Latinx studies. And there was a kind of accountability, learning to become a movement historian within a movement, not having a credential, but being expected to be able to tell people about the histories of organizing within the UFW, and then coming out here in the 90s, working on my dissertation, Bill sending me out to interview these incredible African-American elders, many of them telling stories about organizing, from SNCC, from CORE, you know, from other movement struggles, really going back to the 1920s. Back then, it was possible to interview people who had been born, you know, in the very early 20th century. And some of these were individuals, some of you are familiar with Bob Korstad's wonderful work in the CIO in the 1930s and 40s. We interviewed some of the African-American pioneers of the founding of the CIO in the 1930s. In later years, getting to work with Zaragoza Vargas and his work on Mexican-American workers and Latino workers in the CIO in the 1930s. But the other cool thing in the 90s was when I finished my qualifying exams, I was starting to teach African-American history courses. A lot of them, Bill over at NC State with Blair Kelly, or Blair Murphy, right? And I also would teach what we would call now a Latino Studies course. I would teach a course on the history of agricultural labor and incorporating what was happening in Mount Olive and my experiences in the Farm Worker Project, bringing workers to campus, taking students out to talk to workers about their experiences in North Carolina. And I was doing that for about 3 or 4 semesters, working with Charlie Thompson, the Center for Documentary Studies, which provided us a space to do field work. To me, I'm a field worker. And when we talk about service learning or experiential learning, as we call it now, getting students out is really critical, and getting them to think about the power asymmetries between campus and community, and what our campuses draw from and exploit and take advantage of, right? And so getting the students out into the field was very important back in those days, and it is still very important for the work that we do in Florida. But for several years, in fact, up until 2001, I finished my PhD in 2000, and they were nice enough to arrange a 1-year visiting position for me here while I was, you know, on the job market. I was approached by a group of students at a certain point, I think it was before I defended my dissertation, and they said, you know, you teach Black Studies one semester, and then the other semester you teach a course on farm workers. Could you actually combine those? Could you do something where you bring those things together? So African American and Latino studies. So in 2001, and again, I was not the only person doing this, a lot of grad students here were teaching Latino studies types of courses in the 90s, kind of under the radar. In fact, I only remember one faculty member back then. It was Greg Grandin, who taught a course on Latino history. But by and large, these were grad students, and again, it was because of the demand, because of the huge demographic changes happening in North Carolina. So a group of students approached me. They were also working on the anti-sweatshop campaign at that time, and they said, you know, you teach one course one semester and another course another semester, can you combine those? And so I did, and I looked before this morning, and the first time I taught the course, it was called an African American and Latino, it was African American and Latino Histories, Politics, and Culture. And it was through the Department of Anthropology, interestingly enough. And I think that was because of Charlie's connection to anthropology. That course I've now taught at 3 different institutions. I taught it 7 years at UC Santa Cruz. Every year I taught the course African American and Latino History of the United States. It got bigger and bigger and bigger. By the time I left, I had well over 200 students in the class. It started with like, the first year was like 18. I teach the course now at UF as a senior seminar, and that's really where this book comes from. And if you look at the chapter organization, essentially this is how I've taught the course for many years. The majority of students in this course, wherever I've taught it, well, not at Duke necessarily, but certainly at Santa Cruz and UF, are from big cities. So when I taught at Santa Cruz, the majority of my students were from LA. Now at UF, the majority of my students are from Miami. So that's had a big impact. Our students want to know, where are our people's histories in US history textbooks? Where is Haiti? Where is Mexico? Where is Cuba? They don't want to just have to go to one course on Latin American history. They want to see their people's histories in the mainstream narrative. That's what I've tried to do with this new book. A friend from the West Coast called me last night. He said, Paul, you made a bustle list. I said, really? Which one? It was the 10 books about race to read instead of asking a person of color to explain it to you. So, but the problem is, as an educator, as an organizer, I have to try to explain it to people, right? But it was interesting to see the book, you know, discussed in that light. Today, we are teaching a course at the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program at UF, which I direct, called A Black and Latinx History of the University of Florida. Now, the way that course came about is very illuminating in terms of ethnic studies. These spaces that we have now, that we actually occupy, were created, as far as I know, 100% of the time through student insurgencies. There was always a point, and remember, that's why I started in the 90s. It was the students who approached me, but before that, it was the Chicano blowouts in 1968, right? It was the Third World Strike in San Francisco State in 68 and 69. And over again, you see the importance of student insurgencies in creating ethnic studies, and especially comparative ethnic studies. So over this last summer at the University of Florida, our administration actually demolished 2 very important buildings on campus. One was the Institute for Hispanic Latino Cultures. The other was the Institute for Black Culture. Now, these were side by side at UF, and they were across the street from the main campus. Wonderful old Victorian buildings, but the university really, as many universities do, had let the buildings go, unfortunately. So they had to be demolished. The university told the students, the Black and Latinx students, we're going to rebuild these, we're going to make them better. The students didn't believe the administration. Can you believe that? Students not believing the administration? And so they protested. They marched, they did sit-ins, they demanded that these buildings be replaced as they had been and even better, and they wanted to hold the administration accountable. Keep in mind, they were doing this in the middle of the summer, and I remember my wife Sheila and I were actually visiting with my parents back home in Washington State, and I got a call from a group of student activists one day, mid-July, and they were asking me for advice. They said, we're going to put you on speakerphone, and could you tell us like what next steps we should take? And I said, well, first describe to me the room, and just describe for me how many people are in the room. And they said, well, we have about 80, 90, about 105 students in this room. And I said, stop right there. I said, if you have 105 students and you're engaging in protracted movement organizing and it's mid-July, you don't need my advice. I need to learn from you. But I tell this story because I want, again, to highlight how hungry our students are. And it's more than hunger. It's about their psychological well-being. To have these types of programs are so important. I mean, I didn't have this kind of a program when I was in college. As Bill mentioned, I had incredible mentors at Evergreen State College, but our students need this now more than ever because of the crisis that we're living in. And it isn't just an external crisis. It isn't just Donald J. Trump. In this book, you will encounter people like John Quincy Adams, Alexander Hamilton, you know, some of the usual suspects in U.S. history. In some ways, this is an effort to give a U.S. history textbook kind of overview, but at the same time, what I've discovered in my early talks have been, people have said, well, can you talk about Donald J. Trump and how he fits historically? And I'm like, put Donald J. Trump in a room in 1816 with John Quincy Adams, with James Madison, with Hamilton, if he'd still been around, and put them together. And there's a lot of things they would disagree about, of course, a lot of big disagreements, but there's a few things they would have actually been almost identical on, and a lot of head nodding in that room would have occurred, even between John Quincy Adams at that point. The point in which he's ready to send Andrew Jackson to destroy the Negro fort on the Apalachicola River, which has become a sanctuary for former slaves, for indigenous people, and dissident whites. And that early period of time, Donald J. Trump would have fit right in there. And the statements that John Quincy Adams was making about people from Latin America, about African Americans, about poor whites, are almost exactly the same as the statements that our current federal administration makes. It's very interesting. So there's continuities. The book is really about, and please, there are some obvious typos here. The book is really about finally letting go of American exceptionalism. Because if we really want to change this country, we have to understand that American exceptionalism, this idea of the U.S. as the greatest, freest country on the face of the earth, is an impediment. It's a terrible impediment. What it does for us now, in policy terms, is we say, if only we can get rid of Donald J. Trump and elect a more progressive person, things will be better. Well, I was involved in the debate over comprehensive immigration reform in 2013 to 14. And I can tell you that was a disaster. It was a horrific disaster. It was sabotaged by the Congress. Now, Donald J. Trump played no role in that, right? So I have here, I'll just take you through the chapters and you can look in the handouts real briefly, but we begin with the Haitian Revolution. Because if you're starting with U.S. history and you're talking about events that are important for oppressed people, the Haitian Revolution is at the centerpiece. And Haiti connects the U.S. with the Caribbean, with Latin America, with Africa. And it's a place that over and over again is overlooked and even rejected. There's a new movie out on Simon Bolivar, of all people. It's called El Libertador, the Liberator. And one of the only advantages of flying east to west on that long flight is you get to watch these movies, right? And so I watched this new Spanish language version of this movie about Simon Bolivar. I thought, wow, how cool. And it's very dramatic. It's got great scenes, great battlefield scenes. You know, this person who leads this army of former slaves, indigenous people, dissident whites, including these people that come from Ireland, these freedom fighters that come to help him liberate Central America from the Spanish Empire. But I was just waiting, and as the movie progressed, this great dramatic movie with great production values, I just began to get more and more distraught because I almost could predict what the movie would leave out. In other words, how did this incredible young man, one of the richest men in the history of the Americas, who was born into living in a slave labor camp, owned over 1,000 slaves, human beings, how did he make the transition from being an oppressor to leading an army of liberation. And I waited for it in the movie. I waited, but it didn't happen. What was given credit was his great European mentor, which he did. He had a great teacher as a young man, a very wealthy man growing up. But the key again was Haiti. It was the Haitians who woke him up in contemporary parlance. They said, it's wonderful you're fighting against the Spanish Empire. We hate those guys. We fought against them, and we defeated them. But you didn't. You got driven off the field of battle. We could teach you how to defeat the Europeans. That's what the Haitians did. And in fact, they didn't only just give him military advice. In Special Forces parlance, they sent him military advisors to fight against the Spanish in what is now Venezuela and other parts of Central America. But they told him, you eventually have got to abolish slavery. And so Bolivar becomes this incredible iconic figure among oppressed people all up and down the hemisphere. But unfortunately, still, the Haitians are not given that credit for what they have done. The same thing is true. The Mexican War of Independence is so important in the history of this entire hemisphere. In brief, and because I'm not going to do any reading from the book, by the way, because if I read from the book, you won't buy it. Mexico abolishes slavery even before the end of the War of Independence. And the U.S. begins suing Mexico, or trying to sue Mexico, for lost property, because these people around Madison and others are saying all of these slaves are leaving. They accused Mexico of kidnapping people, kidnapping slaves, and offering them freedom and sanctuary. Well, half of that was true. If you could make it deep into Mexico, you could have sanctuary from slavery, you could have freedom, but Mexico wasn't kidnapping people. Okay, that was something the U.S. made up. The fact that Mexico abolished slavery, the fact that the British were well on their way to abolishing slavery, the fact that most of the world in that part of the world was on the way to abolishing slavery is the single most important fact of U.S. history in the antebellum period. As a group of high school students put it to me a couple years ago, the way you're describing history, it's like Star Wars Rogue One. You have this powerful, booming empire that's spreading oppression, slavery, and yet all around it are these freedom fighters. And I was like, let's play with that for a little while, right? And they were giving me the names of all these different rebel groups. Because I'm not a Star Wars person, I was like, what is that? And taking a lot of notes. But I think the analogy is actually pretty good. It takes us to the lead up, and I have Madison here, and again, I'll skip over a lot of these comments, but at an early point of the Mexican War of Independence, and these are incredible documents. The cool thing about working on this book for such a long period of time was when I first started working on it, I had to go to the National Archives to read these letters from Madison and others. Now you can find these online. So I was able to translate a lot of correspondence written by leaders of the Mexican War of Independence, like Jose Maria Morelos, who wrote directly to James Madison and Jefferson and said, look, you all just fought an anti-colonial war. Could you help us? If we joined together, we would be such a force against European tyranny that you can't even imagine. And what kind of answer do you think the U.S. gave? I'm not going to, again, it's not exactly a plot spoiler, but for our students, it's a big deal. I mean, I work with a lot of first-generation Mexican-American students in my courses. I was one of those back in the day. And they say, you're telling us things about our ancestors, our elders that we didn't even know. And now we want to go back and interview them and talk with them. One of the things I didn't know about my own father was that, in fact, Bill, you'll find this to be interesting. I had already interviewed several hundred people before it occurred to me, hey, I should interview my own father. You know, and we sat down, we turned on the recorder, and almost the first thing out of his mouth was, well, you know, it's interesting. I met Fidel Castro. And I'm like, what? You met what? I said, Dad, why didn't you tell me this? And you know the answer, of course. You never asked. Okay, so what we're trying to do with ethnic studies knowledge, whether we're teaching Latinx histories, Asian American studies, is to do what Earl Lovelace, the great Caribbean novelist, tells us to spark a new curiosity, not only about who they are, but who we are, where we come from. I'll conclude with when Dr. King was assassinated in 1968, I meant it to be one of the chapters. It didn't quite work out that way, but I looked at hundreds of different first takes on Dr. King's assassination. And this now, again, is you can find this online. It's a wonderful teaching tool. I use it with high school teachers. But in my mind, the United Farm Worker Organizing Committee had one of the most compelling first takes on Dr. King's assassination, kind of what his life and death meant. And I use it to frame my introduction, killed helping workers to organize. Because by 1968, in the freest country on earth, you're not supposed to be killed helping workers to organize, right? That should be a right that everyone enjoys. As a historian, I teach the Wagner Act, 1935. As a historian, I have to do one aside before I conclude. When I talk about basic concepts that I learned in U.S. history, and I talk to my students, most of whom are from Haitian American backgrounds, Cuban American, Mexican American, and I throw out the concept of isolationism. And I say, look, when I was trained as an undergrad, we talked about isolationism. The U.S. was an isolationist country. You know how my students respond from Miami or LA? They laugh at me. They think I'm joking. I'm like, no, it's true. This was a main theme in U.S. history. And they're like, well, in Cuba, we can tell you that's not true. In Haiti, we can tell you that's not true. The U.S. has never been isolationist, again, from where we come from. I finished the book, and people have asked me, is this a book about, oppression or resistance? I said, well, it's all those things bound up together. And I finish it by talking about memory, forgetting, remembering. I often start lectures by asking, what's the largest general strike in American history? Or what's the largest general strike in the history of the Americas? I also teach labor history. And so my students will say, or labor organizers even will say, the Haymarket. No. The largest general strike in the history of the Americas. Many of the people sitting in a room will have been involved in it. But the power to get us to forget organizing and struggle and how we challenge oppression is so powerful, we even forget our own accomplishments. Sometimes as scholars, we forget how hard we had to work to build a program. But in 2006, many of us, and some of us in this room, no doubt, were involved in organizing the largest general strike in the history of the Americas, May 1st, 2006. I was teaching in Santa Cruz at that time. Many of my students were in the front lines of that struggle. And it taught us so much about coalition building, working together, and the long struggle yet to come. So thank you for your patience. I really appreciate it, and I will conclude on that note.